Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Society of Filipino Archivists lecture series in celebration of the International Archives Week 2026. We are delighted to have you join us today via Facebook Live for an engaging discussion on archives, memory, justice, and their enduring relevance in our today's society. On behalf of the Society of Filipino Archivists, we thank you for spending part of your day with us. And to formally begin our program, may we invite everyone for the singing of the Philippine National Anthem to be followed by the invocation.
Ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang magiliw, helos ng sinakanan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa manluluping, di ka pasisingil, sa nagagang tutok sa simoy at sa langit ang bagaw, ay hinatang tula, awit sa pagkayang minamahal, ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na nag-iindig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan ang ay di magtitingin. Lumang ang araw ng warhabit pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang higaya na pagkay mga aking, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We thank you, Father, for gathering us today for this webinar. Bless our time of shared learning, discussion, and discovery. Open our minds to new knowledge and understanding, and inspire us to learn from one another with humility and respect. As we reflect on the importance of archives, help us appreciate their value in preserving our collective memory, culture, and history. May they continue to serve society by connecting the past with the present and guiding future generations with wisdom and truth. Grant us a meaningful conversation, fruitful insight, and a spirit of collaboration throughout this session. We ask this in your holy name. Amen. Once again, good morning, everyone. I am Kristan Fernando Ilato, a licensed librarian and the Public Relations Officer of the Society of Filipino Archivists, and I will be serving as your host for today's lecture. We are grateful for your participation as we celebrate International Archives Week under the theme Archives for Justice, Right, Memory, and Future. Before we proceed, allow me to share a few reminders. Questions and comments will be entertained after the lecture proper during our Q&A session. For those experiencing internet interruption, simply refresh your device and reconnect to our Facebook live stream. This webinar is free of charge. To receive your certificate of participation, please make sure to register through the official registration form that is uploaded on our Facebook page. We encourage everyone to actively participate and engage in today's discussion. And with regards to the evaluation link for today's webinar will be sent to the email address you provided during your registration. Please do not share the link to others as it is unique to your account. It will be available until 12 midnight only, and the evaluation form will also serve as your attendance for today. Release of certificates will be on or before the end of the month. And to formally welcome us all today for today's lecture series, it is my pleasure to introduce the president of the Society of Filipino Archivists, Ms. Denise Marisi Bedia. Hi, Ms. Denise. The virtual floor is yours.
Good morning, Tan.
Good morning, Miss.
Professional Regulatory Board for Librarians Chair, Honorable Yolanda C. Granda, National Committee on Archives Head Miss Emma M. Ray, National Committee on Archives Vice Head and Phil Heritage Society President Arnulfo C. Junio, who are all former SFA presidents. Our guest speaker, Dr. Ricardo L. Punzalan, who is also part of the SFA family and one of my college professors in UPSLIS, distinguished guests, colleagues, fellow cultural heritage workers, and friends. Good morning. On behalf of the Society of Filipino Archivists, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you uh, uh, to this year's iteration of the SFA lecture series. Okay, sorry. um, Okay. So, lecture series as we celebrate International Archives Week with the theme Archives for Justice, Rights, Memory, and Futures. When people think of archives, when they often picture passive repositories of the past. But as professionals, we know that archives are alive, dynamic, and deeply entangled with the human condition. They are not just places where history is stored, they are the foundations upon which truth and memory are built. This brings us squarely to the heart of today's timely session. Today, we are step beyond the technicalities of archives administration to confront our ethical duties. We will reflect on the profound relationship between archives and justice, exploring our critical role in reparations and memorialization. As we listen to Dr. Punzalan's uh, discussion this morning, we will be challenged to answer vital questions. What are our obligations to those seeking redress for historical wrongdoings? How can our institutions actively participate and support in justice work and activism? How do we build truly reciprocal relationships with communities advocating for their histories to be acknowledged? For us as Filipino archivists, this hits close to home. Our archives are essential tools for truth telling and accountability. We are not just keepers of records, we are guardians of memory and partners in community healing. I invite you all to listen with an open mind and let this session inspire how you approach your collections and communities moving forward. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome and mabuhay.
Thank you very much, Ms. Denise, for that welcoming message. We now move on to the highlight of today's program. As we celebrate the International Archives Week, we are reminded that archives are not only merely repositories of records, but powerful instruments that preserves memory, uphold accountability, and support justice. Today's lectures invite us to reflect on these important roles. Our lecture for today is entitled The Archives We Keep and the Justice We Seek, Understanding the Role of Archives in Reparative Memory Justice. And to introduce our distinguished speaker, allow me to read his brief biography. Dr. Ricardo Ricky Punzalan is an associate professor of archives and digital curation at the School of Information and director of the Museum Studies program at the University of Michigan. He holds a PhD degree in information from the University of Michigan, along with a graduate certificates in science, technology, and society and museum studies, and earned his BLS and MLIS degrees from the School of Library Information Studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He previously taught at both the University of the Philippines, Diliman School of Library and Information Studies and the University of Maryland College of Information. He serves on the Society of American Archivists Council from 2018 to 2021 and again in 2025 and 2026. He served as a chair of the Native American Archives section from 2017 to 2018 and co-chair of SAA Archival Repatriation Committee from 2022 to 2025. where he led the drafting of the Principles in Indigenous Archival Repatriation in 2025. He is currently on the Board of Trustees of the Library of Congress American Folklife Center. Sir Ricky Punzalan's scholarship on Indigenous community access to digitized archives through virtual reunification has improved archival practices towards more ethical relationship between Indigenous people and heritage institutions. He has significantly shaped the field of critical archival studies, community-centered archival practices, and reparative approach to archives and museums. In 2023, he was inducted as a Fellow of the Society of American Archivists, the highest honor bestowed on individual by SAA for its standing contribution to the organization and to the archives profession. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to present our speaker for today's lecture, Dr. Ricardo L. Punzalan. Dr. Ricky, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Kristen, for that generous introduction. I'm very glad to be here. I will share my slides. Can you all see my slide?
Yes, sir.
Yes, good. As mentioned in the introduction, my presentation today is titled "Archives: The Archives We Keep and the Justice We Seek: Understanding the Role of Archives in Reparative Memory Justice." And I'm particularly elated to be invited by my former national organization many years ago when I was still a professional in the Philippines. I was an active member of SFA. In fact, it's the organization where I founded and built my career as an archivist. The organization that started it all for me and that led me into my current professional work in the United States, and now a very active member of the Society of American Archivists. And I'm also particularly happy that this talk is in conjunction with the International Archives Week. And I'm very glad that the International Council on Archives chose a very timely topic, which is archives for justice, rights, memory, and future. So, all in all, this is a very exciting moment and presentation, and also an opportunity that I'm very elated to accept, and an activity that I'm very proud to be a part of. So, before I start, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement, considering my location in the state of Michigan, and also my work at the University of Michigan. So the University of Michigan is located in on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Bodewadabi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially as a gift through the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids so that their children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. I also want to acknowledge the large presence of Philippine materials, historical, scientific, and cultural items in our archives and museums, and in profound ways also added to the reputation of the university as a research institution. So as a Filipino scholar working in Michigan, I think it's my duty to highlight the presence of Filipino and indigenous Filipino materials, cultural heritage collections in our libraries, archives, and museums at the university. So my goals for today includes, a reflection on the relationship between archives and justice. When I received the invitation to speak, I said, what would be a good topic of reflection for me and as well as the audience. And I said, I think I should focus on what the relationship has been between archives and justice, as articulated by archivists and also archival thinkers. Particularly, the role of archives in reparation and memorialization. So I created these questions to answer for us this afternoon. The first one is, what are the obligations of archivists to those seeking redress and acknowledgement of historical wrongdoings and legacies of past harms? And also, what types of justice work and activism are archives best suited to support? Um, so I'm interested in these questions because I'm deeply engaged right now in what I would call reparative work pertaining to colonial and indigenous collections at this university, materials taken during the American colonial period and returning them back to communities of origin, many of whom are indigenous Filipinos, and also what reciprocal relationships could mean, uh, particularly in a community or a group's pursuit of justice, and also how do we advocate for their histories, particularly histories that are under acknowledged or never acknowledged or even remembered, particularly historical injustices that have occurred in the past. I think one of the things that um, I'm really passionate about in the field of archives, and me being a Filipino and being aware of the archival history and practice and scholarship in the Philippines, is that actually the Philippine case, or archival history, Philippine archival practice, and even the knowledge that we have on archives and the country's relationship with archival work actually could offer a whole lot of um, necessary uh, theoretical and scholarly intervention in the field of archives. In fact, I would admit that my career in the United States as an archival scholar has been completely founded on my understanding of archives from the Filipino perspective. So if in the audience today there are students of archives, particularly in the Philippines, or any Filipino archivist studying archives right now, I really want to encourage you to um, look at archival practice and history in the Philippines as that of a kind of area that has so much potential to intervene in how we think about archives and archival practice, and beyond the Western notions of archiving. Actually, we have so much to offer as a group of people with our own unique set of histories and cultures and perspectives around archives. Again, I'd like to emphasize that I would not get to uh, this point in my career if I did not believe in the power of Filipino archival ideas as powerful ideas that could advance archival theory, archival thinking, and archival practice, and also archival scholarship. So I'd just like to emphasize that for today. So you know, and I'd like to deliver a presentation like this to a Filipino audience because I think the Philippines is ripe for a kind of recognition on how by thinking about the Filipino archival experience could actually be a huge a way to advance archival scholarship and thinking. So I'm actually one of the founders of what we now call the critical archival studies. In fact, when I was a doctoral student in mid 2000 at Michigan, I actually coined the term critical archival studies. I contacted my colleagues in the academic community in North America, and I said, can we further develop this idea of critical archival studies? I want to explore what it means to pursue this area. And together with my archival colleagues, Michelle Caswell and TK Sangwand, we wrote an introduction to a special issue on critical archival studies, which is now, as an area of the discipline being used to explore different ways we could think about archives and how we could study archives and also influence archival practice. So in our area we define critical archival studies as those approaches that explain what is unjust in the current state of archival research and practice. We posit practical goals for how such research and practice can and should change, and also provide the norms for such critique. In this way, critical archival studies, like critical theory, is emancipatory in nature, with the ultimate goal of transforming archival practice in society writ large. As an academic field and profession, critical archival studies broadens the field's scope beyond an inward, practice oriented orientation and builds a critical stance regarding the role of archives in the production of knowledge and different types of narratives, as well as identity construction. I'm um, I'm highlighting this definition today, particularly and particularly because I think that for archivists to succeed in the work, and for us to be able to expand the horizons of our practice, I think we need to look at archival work as something deeper than the usual assumptions that we have about archival uh, of the archival field, and part of that expansion is to be critical of the work. When I say critical, it actually doesn't mean I want to abolish everything and uh, undo the work of people before me. Critical here means we acknowledge that there are certain factors and forces in our society and the world around us that are so imposing, insurmountable, and also bearing a huge influence in how we uh, pursue archival practice and research. So the critique that you do is not necessarily about being inadequate as an archivist, or uh, you know or doing a kind of fault finding mission. So critical archival studies is not about finding faults, but I think it's looking at particular systems and power relations that we that are so embedded in the work and in the practice, that a single archivist cannot um, overpower, but collectively, by changing archival practice and our orientation towards practice, we could change. So I'm coming from this particular perspective, that I just like to uh, emphasize before I proceed with this talk. So I know that there might be non-archivists in the audience. So a kind of orientation point as well for me is to um, give you my own understanding of archives. For my friends who are archivists, you probably heard this before, but maybe this is a good refresher for all of us. So what do we mean by archives? One idea of archives that that is very maybe known to us is that archives are institutions. These are institutions where you um, tasked to preserve records. They are a place, and look, you there's a particular location, a tangible um, building where materials are held and stored. Um, and also, archives are records of permanent and ongoing historical value. So, the materials, the records that you keep in an archival institution are also called archives. So it means that so when I say archives, I also mean not just the institution, but the records of permanent and historical value that we keep and deem to be archival in value. Archives are also the actions that we impose on those records, the programmatic processes and activities we implement to safeguard those records. So, sometimes you hear people say, I'm archiving materials. I'm my duty is to archive these things. It's in a way you're using the terminology as a kind of action, the things that you do uh, in order to pursue archival work. There's a more contemporary terminology that you probably hear in your daily life, which is archives as data storage. Like for instance, your email, you archive your email. There's an archive function in some of your probably computers. And so there's in a sense that there's a kind of understanding, I guess, from the typical function of archives that people see, that they started calling putting things in storage as archiving. But so there's also that notion. I don't pertain to archives, not so much as that. That's not my notion of archiving, meaning simply storing something and forgetting them. That's not my understanding of archives. There's also a loftier understanding of archives as the traces of like a collective trace of or evidence of human activity. It's our symbol of our collective belonging, that we belong to a nation, for instance. So the National Archives of the Philippines is such an embodiment of our collective belonging and our connections with the past and the people that's been ahead of us. Excuse me. And so archives could also be much more than what I mentioned. There are definitely in scholarship and in the literature, you will see people using archives more in kind of metaphorical sense to mean everything that's been created, all the world's knowledge, so forth and so on. There's that kind of sense of archives. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to um, look at archives in the first three instances of or the first three bullets that I presented, and also um, also fifth bullet, which is, the collective sense and the symbolic meaning of archives. So for today's topic, we're looking at the relationship between archives and justice. Um, so there's a deep connection between evidence and accountability, right? And that's where usually archival records are situated, right? Like uh, records exist as evidence, and because they are evidence of transactions, activities, or um, that you could use to trace back decisions, um, and performance of duties, and also whatever is captured in the record. We can use those evidence to hold people and institutions accountable. So that's why the usual relationship that we ascribe to records is that records are evidence, and therefore could be used for purposes of accountability. Um, Records are also used for historical redress, meaning if, let's say, you know, uh, a community or a person is claiming historical wrongdoing, like a wrongdoing that occurred in the past, and nobody could remember it because perhaps um, the harm was committed several generations ago, but this particular community still carries that memory. Sometimes looking at those records as evidence that something that they claim to have happened, that's been passed down as stories for generation, then you find them in records, and sometimes those records are used as redress. Like for instance, I'll give a North American example. So the forced removal of indigenous children, and then putting them in boarding schools, for instance. There's a movement right now in the United States and Canada, and I think other parts of the world as well, of tracing those children that have been taken from their families forcibly, to put them um, in care of institution, or or you know um, or also tracing what happened to the children, and also uh, the descendants seeking justice for the children that have been taken into boarding school. So finding yearbooks of those boarding schools, finding photographs, finding records and reports, and all of that are being used to for such historical redress, to acknowledge that that action done by Western institutions against indigenous or native children, while at that time perhaps were accepted as the norm, is now is being challenged as unacceptable, unacceptable then, and also more so unacceptable now. So, like the creation of those records and use of those for historical redress is very important. So for seeking justice of of a past harm that still impacts a community today, right? So that's what we mean by historical redress, right? Like harm that occurred in the past, but you know communities are still experiencing the pain and the legacies of such action. So it's also records are also used to challenge systemic injustice. So when we say systemic, it means something that occurs repeatedly, but requires us to be able to show pattern of of such injustice. Like, so the best sometimes way to show a pattern, repeated offense, or deeply ingrained, deeply embedded, that not one individual could see, but actually could see collectively over time. Sometimes records are used to do that. That you can see those patterns more easily, they're more legible in records. Not that, and because those experiences are usually felt by certain groups of people, and uh, not everyone in society. Sometimes it's records help in isolating the targets of systemic injustice, particularly if it's focused on particular groups of individuals. So for instance, the LGBTQ plus community, or the African American communities in the United States. So uh, historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. And also, now there are movements to circumvent traditional institutions and focus on community archiving, meaning specific communities practice their own grassroots um, level archiving, because for the longest time, Western and traditional institutions have ignored them. And there's an understanding that as a community, while your history is being ignored by like a large Western institution, it does not mean it's not worthy of preservation. In fact, a part of a systemic injustice that occurs in society sometimes is to be told that your history does not matter. And because it does not matter, institutions do not collect your records for permanent keeping, and that your histories are not represented in traditional archival repositories. And by traditional archival repositories, I mean academic archives, university archives, the national archives, or so forth and so established institutions. So there are certain communities that for the large part would say that they've never been represented by these institutions, nor these institutions are interested in representing them. So the recourse is to pursue community archiving, like meaning communities take charge of the archiving of their own histories. So that's a kind of it's justice work, because again, I'll go back to my point earlier, that sometimes the relationship of archives with justice is that of acknowledgement of um, long-term systemic pattern of being ignored or being abused, and most of the time those two are coupled together, meaning um, communities that have been largely marginalized are also largely exploited. And the marginalization, the willful or sometimes maybe um, under acknowledgement of these communities contribute to furthering the injustice for such communities. Like so, uh, for example, of furthering the injustice of for some communities is basically when when your community is regarded not important enough, therefore you should not get basic um, services, right? So be it healthcare, um, other civil and benefits or rights like right to marriage, or you are not considered part of the entire community, that your identity is questioned, therefore you are you don't get to establish your citizenship or belonging, and therefore you don't receive usual state services because you are not considered eligible for such because you are not part of a community. So marginalization often leads to, or is the justification for a person not receiving rights or a sense of justice because they're denied the identity to belong, and therefore to be eligible for certain rights and benefits. So community archiving often is a way for those communities that have been ignored and marginalized um, to create a body of materials, collections, or records to show that we are actually a community and we belong here. Okay, so the late Terry Cook, uh, archival scholar, academic, once said that our central professional concepts of respeto fons, original order, and provenance were designed precisely in order to preserve records as evidence. This transparency allows records to serve as trustworthy evidence of the facts, actions, and ideas of which they bear witness, to which they are, in short, the evidence. So one of the important professional identities we have as archivists is that we say that by following these principles of provenance and original order, tracing the chain of custody, that the records we have are authentic, and that they are reliable, and that they are they are what they say they are, meaning there was no tampering, and there was no fraud that occurred in the process of organizing and creating those records. And by following the principles of provenance and original order, we are being transparent, and this will allow records to serve as evidence, and that we can trust them, that what they contain are facts, and the actions, ideas they represent could bear witness, to events. And so in a large part, it's actually sometimes archival action that renders records their evidentiary and trustworthy characteristic, right? So this is why we could trust records kept by archival institutions, because we could trace the lineage of the practice and how they follow particular professional principles and practice. So in a way, that's how archivists have safeguarded, what you would say, um, the moral footing of the archival field, right? Like the claim that our work, by pursuing the traditional work of archivists, that we are able to justify, the presence of records as trustworthy evidence. So that's the typical understanding and appreciation of the relationship between records and evidence, that eventually, when we use these records as evidence for either, let's say, a court case, or even evidence as a historian writing a book of whether something really happened or not, and then we use those records, or just someone looking for a relative's birth certificate, or creating you know let's say a family tree, and or establishing one's identity as being belonging to a community, or or a family relationship, familial relationship. We can trust those records because the archivists were perform their duties based on these particular principles. So the relationship of evidence and archival practice is also very, very tightly coupled, and that's the assumption that we have. um, However, sometimes um, there are cases where records could be manipulated, um, tampered with, and in the sense that upon their creation, it's the either through the limitation of the people creating those records, their biases, or their inability to see and document particular individuals or groups. In a way, sometimes records are also could be used against certain people and certain communities. So if we know that some records, even though let's say they're authentic records, they're real records, but their content are actually not accurate depiction of what actually happened, uh, what precautions can we take? Because if you look at history, that records are also often used to by colonial officials to further marginalize certain communities. So like we should not forget that archival that records were also tools in their active lives to um, organize people, categorize people, and label people in particular ways. Like for instance, a good example is having a birth certificate, establishing your citizenship. Without such birth certificate, it's very hard to get a passport that would also validate your your citizenship. But in some cases, in other parts of the world, actually, you see examples of people being denied, the basic right to have a record about themselves and be identified as a citizen of a particular nation. So those, I'm just using an extreme example just to give you, an idea of sometimes, you know, records are could be tools of oppression and marginalization as well. And even when people are not necessarily tampering and creating inauthentic records, but you can use records in particular ways, and in particular efforts to marginalize and deny people of rights. So what could we take as a precaution as archivists? So for instance, I've listed down some of the what my colleague here in Michigan, David Wallace, in his article on archives and social justice, as connecting archival uh, yeah, connecting records with like different difficult as well as also positive efforts. Like, so you use records to support xenophobia uh, as a tool of colonialism, but you can also use records as to decolonize. um, but some communities have created records in aid of genocide and slavery and racism. Uh, Also, you could use records for civil rights, uh, indigenous sovereignty. So like, so there's this kind of duality of records, right? Like sometimes you can use records for good, and sometimes you could use records for bad. So But records and archives uh, could simultaneously enact injustices and also could be central in justice seeking efforts. So that's what I'm trying to articulate here for now. That in the same way that records could be used for justice, records could also be used for injustice. I'll give you um, some examples later. So, but what do we mean by justice in the first place? I was actually thinking about this. Like we like to talk about archives and associate archives with justice. But what is justice in the first place? I've looked at this particular source that called Types of Justice, and they listed four types of justice when people in the contemporary times talk about justice. The first one is that of distributive justice or economic justice, which is which is about giving all members of society a fair share, equal benefit and resources that's available for all. Everyone gets their fair share. No one gets more, no one gets less. It's a fair share. That's a kind of equity, economic justice. Sometimes when we talk about things that are unjust, it means we're not getting our fair share, and you could see other people in society or other communities getting more than what their fair share. So sometimes that's what we mean by justice. The other sense of justice that we talk about, and that I think is also very much related to archives, is procedural justice. Um, Making and implementing decisions according to fair processes that ensure fair treatment. So that when we use sometimes when we comment that something unjust happened, it's because you did not get a fair treatment from people supposedly uh, are protecting you, like for instance law enforcement, like the police, like police brutality. The very instrument of the state that should protect people um, are attacking their own people. So or a bureaucratic agency, let's say um, um, let's say the Civil Service Commission, like not favoring particular individuals to be promoted uh, for a variety of unfair reasons, and so sometimes when you say something unjust happened to me, it's because the procedure that should have been implemented to ensure that you are protected, that your rights are safe, and that then you are free to exercise your rights and get your benefits. Somehow that process was hampered. The other sense of justice is that of retributive justice, meaning retribution, meaning the idea of that a person is deserves to be treated the same way as the other person. So meaning if you steal from someone, um, a sense of justice is for you to for that person to return what they stole from you. But it gets complicated when in cases of like let's say murder or many other heinous crime. Sometimes it's like the eye for an eye rule is not often the best recourse, but some people, that's what they mean when they talk about justice, right? Like somehow I am owed something and I need to get something back that approximates what was owed or what was taken from me, right? Like that kind of um, you know retribution. And then there's also sometimes a sense of restorative justice, which is about healing, a victim's wounds, restoring offenders uh, to law-abiding lives, and repairing harm done to interpersonal relationship and the community. So this kind of justice is more like basically when harm has been committed, you know, instead of exacting retribution, what you seek is, acknowledgement of harm, because for the victims or for the communities, this is actually more meaningful, such acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and also for the offender to admit that they've wronged, and that they will practice a kind of reparative work to as a corrective in seeking amends. Um, so in all of these types of justice, I'm pretty sure that in your heads right now you are thinking of the different ways that records and archives and archival repositories and archivists could play a role, right? So in distributive justice, identifying people who are denied of benefits and resources, procedural justice, the capacity of records and archives to provide evidence on which uh, uh, you know part of the processes and which individuals are often neglected or ignored in receiving fair treatment in the application of the law and policies and procedures. In retributive justice, identifying the harm and or the harms that's been committed, and in restorative justice, which is like the using records for healing and memorialization, and also using records as a way to enable community healing through the use of sound recordings and photography and film, or sometimes writing a testimonial or letter admitting to the person's harm or guilt, or like the impact on the victim. Writing such an impact letter sometimes could be powerful for such efforts. So in many ways, again, I'd like to highlight that in all of these examples, archives and records have a role in uh, the administration or administration of justice, or the acknowledgement of injustice. And then there's another sense of justice that I'd like to talk about, which is social justice. Archival scholar Wendy Duff and her colleagues wrote a definition of social justice in these terms. She said, "Ideal vision that every human being is of equal and incalculable value." Excuse me. Entitled to shared standards of freedom, equity, and respect. These standards also apply to broader social aggregations such as communities and cultural groups. So, the acknowledgement that a person has equal and incalculable value, and that also you could see this in the aggregate communities and cultural groups have equal and incalculable value. So, violations of these standards must be acknowledged and confronted. It specifically draws attention to the inequalities of power and how they manifest in institutional arrangements and systemic inequalities that further the interest of some groups at the expense of others in the distribution of material goods, social benefits, rights, protections, and opportunities. Social justice is always a process and can never be fully achieved. So we are always aspiring towards social justice, social equity. Including a definition of social justice here, coming from archival scholars, because I think most of the time when we think of justice, we always think of justice from a legal or juridical perspective, right? Or like the court system or some tribunal, right? Like you that somehow justice is only administered by our courts. In many ways, that's true. You know, when somebody harms you, you you file a case against them, and the court will decide. But there's also a larger sense of justice, which that we call social justice, which is more like a common responsibility for all of us, that we have to make sure that that uh, you know uh, people around us, our neighbors, not just people who are related to us, but people in general are you know getting the same freedom and equality and respect from everyone else, right? So meaning we are all part of creating a sense of just and equitable society. So we don't just I just don't want to um, in this talk today emphasize that justice is something that you can only that is only the responsibility of the courts or tribunals, but actually it's everyone's responsibility, right? Like that ensuring that our institutions are just, that we work for institutions that are just, and that there is in my from my own perspective, that there are roles for records and archivists in ensuring social justice. Let me proceed and tell you in what I mean by this role in social justice. So over the years, and I think this was also mentioned in the beginning, uh, before my introduction, even on the uh, for this event, is that the archivists are moving beyond the traditional keepers of records or keepers of archives. Um, that we are becoming more of a documenter of atrocities and abuse, or basically just documenters of society, not just of abuse and atrocities, just documenter of society, period, in general. And that some archivists are performing more of an activist role, advocating for human rights uh, and social justice. And some archivists become mediator for facilitating the activation and mobilization of records for justice. So in contemporary human rights landscape, in contemporary world of activism, and also in many other parts of the world, the work of archivists has become more active in facilitation of activism and mobilization. So it's no longer the case that archivists wait in the archival repository or in the reading room for someone to use the record. Most of the in some instances, it's the archivist who will contact authorities of or civil rights groups or activists and alert them of the presence of certain records that will help the cause of justice. So there's a whole kind of expansion of archival work and responsibility along these lines. So archivists are not just keepers. We also document society, and sometimes we become activists for truth and accountability, particularly when it comes to human rights and social justice. And sometimes we act as mediators or facilitators on the activation and mobilization of records to achieve social justice and human rights. So in 2017, I wrote a very short letter to archivists when I saw that we're entering a time of political uncertainty and unrest, and also protest movement. Um, and I gave 5 points as advice to novice or incoming archivists. The first one is like committing ourselves to becoming agents of truth, accountability, and social justice. I think our professional lives as archivists become meaningful if we attach a loftier and grander ideas around the value of our work, which is actually true. That if you think about it, the work of archivists is that of guarding truth and ensuring accountability, and for a great measure, facilitating social justice, not just outside our institutions, also within, ensuring that we um, practice fairness and equity. Um, and that we articulate and affirm truth, accountability, and social justice as values of the profession, right? Like that this is I'm in this field not because I want to put records in boxes or preserve them. Yes, I do those things, but there's something loftier and grander about the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. Those are founded on these ideas of truth, accountability, and justice. And also, the acknowledgement that there's emotional labor and vulnerability in this particular work, particularly when in very trying and difficult moments, that you are vulnerable to political attacks, and that the records of particularly atrocities or injustice that you see sometimes will impact you and affect you. And that work makes you a co-witness to the struggles of those who have been traditionally in the margins of our society. So in many ways, archivists are co-witnesses of societal struggles and injustices and inequalities. And we see them in our records, we see the evidence in our repositories, and because of this work, we are it takes a kind of emotional toll and vulnerability on archivists, and we need to acknowledge that the emotional labor of archivists in this particular moment. And and that also there are groups and communities that are more at risk than we are, and that we still possess a relative measure of relative privilege because we occupy certain positions in our institutions and in society. And that that co-witnessing is such a responsibility and a privilege, but also realizing that while we sometimes become a target uh, of uh, of malicious attacks because we guard truth and accountability. Uh, we, despite those things, and also like that, we are vulnerable because we see emotionally difficult material in our collections. We still enjoy relative privilege compared to other marginalized groups. So sometimes, we have to think in those terms in order for us to continue the work in these trying moments. So you know in in around the same time, like we've gave some pointers on how we can advance social justice in archives. The first is, being aware that underrepresented and marginalized sectors of society are often not included in collecting and in our collections. So ensuring that that our collections reflect the entirety, the totality of societies and communities around us. Uh, that sometimes we need to reinterpret, rethink, and expand archival ideas of provenance. For instance, in order to accommodate such expansion of our work and inclusion of other groups in records, or sometimes even the way we can find uh, communities and people and groups in our collection. So for instance, I'll give you a good example. Most of the time, indigenous communities are documented by uh, anthropologists or scholars or some government official or colonial official that went to their communities and started writing records, recording them, and then their records end up in an archival repository by virtue of the principle of provenance in its traditional sense. All those records that he or she created um, to document a community, will be ascribed under their name. That's why here in the University of Michigan, the biggest collection of archives pertaining to indigenous communities is the Dean C. Worcester collection. But you have to know uh, Dean Worcester to know that he was an American colonial official, that he went to the different communities of the Philippines in the early 1900s to document them. So, finding records following the traditional notion of provenance, and which puts like the attribution of those records to this one colonial official, makes it harder for indigenous communities to find records about them, because often I'm just using the Worcester example because that's what's known to me. But can you imagine other communities of the world where they did not even know, or there's no recollection or remembrance or any um, evidence that a particular person went to their community, that person went to their community and documented them, but because they don't know that person, they can't find those records about them because they're buried in archival collections, because records are organized by the record creator through provenance. So, in a way, we need to rethink provenance to, and archival scholars in recent years have done that, expand notion of provenance to include communities that are documented in records, not just the person who documented them, because that is so crucial for finding records of indigenous communities, for instance. So that's one example I'll give on expanding archival concepts. Development of community archives, which I've mentioned earlier. some we need not have an antagonistic relationship with community archives. In fact, I do think that it's the duty of professional archivists to care about archives, whether it's in their institution or not. Our loyalty, I think, should be in the preservation of records. And because of that, we should be willing to help uh, any community or any organization seeking um, a kind of professional assistance or help or advice in how to preserve their records. So I think that's that's our role in the development of community archives. Provide assistance and expertise, and if it's not needed, it or it's unwelcomed or uninvited, then we walk away because in respect of the sovereignty of communities. So I think but we do have a role in community archives movement. Um, Rethink archival education and training, and I think this is very pertinent for the Philippines. Uh, Acknowledging the long colonial history, um, also the political landscape of the Philippines. I think it's very, the Philippines is really, I tell you, very exciting place to think about archival education and training, because we have such diverse histories, and also diverse communities, and also long history of marginalization that makes it like a unique blend of experiences that we could think of education and training in different ways for the country. And also supporting efforts to document human rights violations. So I mentioned earlier that one of the newer responsibilities that we think that archivists are doing is that of documentation, not just keeping records, but actually actively pursuing ways to document an 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 activity or an injustice that they see around them. So other scholars have also discussed, like the um, social justice efforts in archives, like presenting evidence of multiple viewpoints of past injustices, from direct perpetrators and passive observers to understand and corroborate unjust acts, substantiate that earlier social norms that legitimated historical injustice have shifted across the passage of time. Um, for instance, in regards to race, gender, ethnicity, class, state-based violence. So records have a role, in showing the changing climate and changing practices and changing attitudes around something, and demonstrate that, like the past injustice occurred, and that it's only possible to recognize that because of the shifting values of society, and those are seen in records, and records could substantiate those claims, demonstrate that antecedent institutional collecting practices were biased and prejudiced, as evidenced by their silences and exclusions. So, a good way to enact social justice in our repository is to say, we've been silent for many years of this particular historical activity that we know is happening, and it's a gap in our collection, and we've traditionally excluded certain groups in our collection. Now is the time to undo that and start shifting our practice to include those unheard voices. And also, archives allow for intergenerational transmission of eyewitness experiences with injustice, keeping those oral histories and testimonies, right? Um, in some cases, for instance, I could think of the what happened in Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide, when a lot of young people died in that genocide. And so there's a generational gap between, like the elderly and the younger people, because in the middle, a lot of the uh, children were killed, and some kids have matured and grown up. And there's a role for records for such intergenerational conversation, and to show a kind of missing generation, um, documented in records. And so records have a role sometimes in transmitting past um, harms towards, like, the next generation. There's also one thing that, I don't know, this might be controversial for some of you, but the idea of an activist archivist, um, as one way to ensure justice work in archives. Uh, Rand Jimerson, former president of the Society of American Archivists and also an archival academic, once said that an activist archivist is one who embraces diversity in order to represent all voices in society, not just the political, economic, social, and intellectual elites. So, meaning everyone, not just the elite. Um, Mark Green uh, once said that being an who is an opponent of the activist archivist movement is like that it risks overly politicizing and ultimately damaging the archival profession. um, Without the goal of neutrality, we will inevitably have archivists, as Harry said, pursuing any and every political agenda. So that's the kind of counterpoint to the idea of becoming an activist archivist. But Vern Harris, the South African archivist, said that there's a strong correlation between oppression and thorough record keeping, because the exercise of political power hinges on control of information, which is a very astute observation. I think we know that, yeah, control of information is also control of records, and it's all about political uh, power. So if you are an archivist and seeing this happening in front of you and you do nothing, I I think there's some case to be made around, like appropriate ethical conduct in that situation. Michelle Caswell once said that archivists, like any other bureaucrats in a system, bear responsibility for and complicity in the overarching end goal of the system. Are we going to carry on with business as usual, even if that business involved facilitating injustice, including in extreme cases mass murder, as did the Stasi file clerks in Germany? Or are we going to question our neutrality and resist? So these are just the different perspectives around, becoming an activist archivist. So there's a big debate on, you know accepting social justice as an archival imperative. Um, Mark Green, who opposed it, says that um, pursuing social justice risks overly politicizing and ultimately damaging the archival profession. And for him, it's not the job of the archivist to lead the social justice crusade, but it's our job to pursue, acquire, and make available the records that will, among other things, allow social justice crusaders to show that injustice has occurred. Without the work of the archivist, it would be impossible to present proof. If we believe in the goal of something called social justice, we can be proud that our profession ensures that relevant documentation survives. So for him, our role is just to document and keep them, and not be pursue like activist work. But for Michelle Caswell, um, for her, she believes that social justice is a human imperative and not just an archival one. So, meaning we are human beings. Social justice is our responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility. Why does it have to go out the window simply because you're an archivist? So, in the face of overwhelming inequality, we have a primary ethical responsibility as humans to work towards more just society. So she criticizes Mark Green because he misses the basic observation that power is imbricated in the creation of records. Contrary to positivist conceptions, records aren't neutral byproduct of activity, they are discursive agents through which power is made manifest. Records both produce and are produced by violent acts, and the photographs of an Abu Ghraib were not neutral by byproduct of torture, but part and parcel of it. The torture was staged for the camera. The photographs are not only records of abuse, but vehicles through which abuse was enacted. So, you see here the kind of dynamic between two perspectives on the role of archivists and archives in social justice. So, so who controls the past? So access to records and archives shapes in part what is knowable. So around what we understand to be collectively a social memory, and the control over archives and records involve the deep interplay of power, politics, law, memory, ethics, connected in to our notions of accountability. So, so for instance, like I'll give you one example, and probably you've heard of this case because this happened many years ago. The Guatemalan National Police Historical Archive. So the human rights abuses in Guatemala, was a civil war that lasted for 36 years. In 2005, human rights investigator went to check on reports of improperly stored explosives on the grounds owned by the Guatemalan National Police, and they uncovered the archives of the National Police, which they purported did not exist. So the police said they don't have such records, and then accidentally the records were discovered. There were 75 million pages of state documents, from ranging from driver's license applications to personnel files, to traffic tickets, reports of complaints, criminal reports, invoices, and registries of arrests. Over 100,000 documents that detailed the surveillance and fate of thousands of approximately 35,000 Guatemalan who disappeared during the 5 years of internal warfare between 1950 and 1996. So these records became basically evidence of the people who disappeared. And boxes were marked assassinations and disappeared, and held identity cards, fingerprint files, interrogation records, ledgers with names and photographs. So going back to the previous slide, where like I was saying, records are basically tools for human rights abuse. In this case, the disappearance and mass killing of people. While the very same records that were tools to of injustice and human rights violation, down the road later on when it was discovered, became the same evidence uh, of uh, of such injustice, and now used as a vehicle for at least justice in the memory sense, like meaning acknowledging that these people who disappeared because of some state sanctioned practice, and that they are not unknowable. These people are knowable because they are listed and registered in records, and that these records exist. So so um, if you're interested in this case, read this book called Paper Cadavers, The Archives of this Dictatorship in Guatemala. So, on my favorite quote from this book says, the very documents that made state violence possible can empower relatives and friends of those victims of violence to protect historical memory, expose the administrators of state terrorism, and help to bring them to justice. So, again, underscoring my point earlier of records being complicit in injustice and atrocity, but also could be the very tools of such violence could be used in our search for justice, and the role of the archivist is towing the fine line between those two extreme cases. So, engaging in the ethics of memory, because I think ultimately records are about memory. Uh, and that we need to have a greater self examination and action within our increasingly complex and interconnected global environment, right? What's happening in the Philippines is heard in the rest of the world, and what's happening in some parts of the world somewhat uh, is related um, or familiar to the Philippines and Filipinos. So, responsibilities and roles of archivists, especially the tension between the cultural authority derived from being seen as even-handed, professional, or neutral, and the overt and subtle pulls of power, the complex relationship between ethics, memory, justice, and politics, and the generational and transgenerational responsibilities to the past, and the effect of meeting um, of those responsibilities are not on the present. So, thinking about the ethical role of archivists in memory and memory formation is, I think, very crucial at this moment. So, there's a tenuous role of veracity and the versioning of the past. Which version? And I mean, I think as archivists, we have to understand, where do I sit, in these competing versions of the past, and the adequacy and inadequacy of memory as remedy or device to use the past to render a more just and humane present, because we cannot just always rely on memory, because memory is faulty, and memory in our records derived from records could also be faulty, but particularly in this debate around which version of events of the past should we follow, or or if there's a lot of disagreement on versions of events, and the potency of archives to replicate, challenge, and even undermine ingrained perceptions about the past, and to create new pasts. So there's the so memory ethics is really an interesting foray into thinking about archival work, like, because we do engage in in uh, the facilitation of what's remembered and what's forgotten. Um, so I saw this article and I highly recommend reading this, especially if you're interested in, um, you know, m- memory and justice. Uh, the From duty to remember and obligation to memory. To include memory-related initiatives in the frameworks of reparation suggests that in the aftermath of massive violence, any viable construction of the future has to pass through a thorough recognition and knowledge of the past. In this way, reparative memorial practices progressively move from the transitional justice field to find a place within the system of reparation for human rights violations. Practices of memory become components of the international national legal obligation to repair. So there's more movement now to, um, especially in international tribunals and international human rights courts, to not just collect records and evidence, but also to memorialize and obligate countries and communities to memorialize atrocities in order to prevent those atrocities from happening again. Because sometimes, seeking justice that ends at perpetrators being in jailed, or perpetrators getting their punishment, um, does not solve the problem of those um, atrocities from ever repeating again. So one way to ensure that atrocities are not repeated again is through commemoration and memorialization. So creation of archives, creation of museums, creation of public events, and public memorials of atrocities, not to celebrate them, but to remind us that those atrocities should never happen again. So it's in some sectors of justice, people say that it's not enough for the perpetrators to be in jail, that we need to commemorate and remember those atrocities so that they don't ever happen again. And for many legal theorists, this is part of justice. So the obligation to memory. So, which takes me to the end of my talk, which is reparative memory justice, which is looking at, collective remembering, storytelling, truth telling to address systemic harms like colonialism, state violence, and systemic oppression. I think, in this talk, I've given you different um, avenues to think about justice and injustice, justice from the legal human rights system to social justice that carries more of a social uh, perspective that becomes a, a combined or common responsibilities for all of us, and that archivists are not exempted from such practice and the debates behind that. But in contemporary archives, where I sit right now in my academic world of archives in North America, there are three R's that we are looking at in the field. The first is repatriation, the return of cultural object to its place or community of origin. What is archival repatriation and how does that look like? Um, the next is reparations, which is a terminology that I've been using alongside memory earlier, is the act of making amends for wrong or injury, often through payment or other actions like acknowledgement, apology, erasing violations, um, perpetrator accountability, so forth and so on. So when the role of archives in reparation is very strong, particularly in creating evidence that becomes basis for admission, apology, or memorialization. And then reciprocity, which is the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefit, especially privileges. I think, archival reciprocity is an important concept. I think most of the time archivists are painted in this particular narrow notion of, archivists have an extractive relationship with communities, meaning you go there, you get their stuff, and then you keep them. But we should create avenues for reciprocity, meaning we're not just there to take but also to give something to the community. But what is that? So there's a definition of reciprocity that I really like and I follow. And by the way, I've wrote an article that was published in American Archivist on reciprocity in archives. If you're interested in reading more on reciprocity, but this is and I've taken this definition of reciprocity as in four senses. The first one is reciprocity as giving back, which or involving power flowing back and forth between parties, ensuring that relationships are not extractive. This is what I was talking about with creating a non-extractive relationship with communities. You're not just there to take records, but you're also there to give, and then but articulating what you are giving in return is very important. And then sharing of knowledge, cyclical and circulating responsibility to teach what one has learned, passing on knowledge between generations. So here, this is the another role of archives and archivists, right? Like generational knowledge, passing it on back and forth between the institution and community. And the other one is relational accountability, where relationships are characterized by respect and interest of communities inform all aspects of work. So what is our relational accountability to the communities represented in our records and archives? And then finally, a reciprocity is circular and continuous, not a system of gifts and counter gifts, but more of a constant coexistence and kinship, like a real relationship with communities. So that's one angle that I'd like to offer all of us to think about is like what is archival reciprocity and how do we enact reciprocity um, in our uh, um, in our responsibility to document and record communities and the injustices that's affecting our communities. So and finally, I will leave with this slide. In terms of reparative justice, like we play an important role in reparative justice, but we cannot succeed without societal trust and support. We need society and society's support and trust to do this, and we are as professionals most effective as an ensemble, working in tandem with journalists, academics, artists, activists, lawyers, documentary filmmakers, and many more. We should not see this work as something that we do alone, but something we do in conjunction with other people. And that's the best way to activate records and mobilize them towards justice. So I will end here and I'd be happy to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Punzalan, for that insightful and thought-provoking presentation. We shall now proceed to our question and answer session. Participants may submit their question through the following Slido link. Just simply type on your web browser slido.com and use the code 1230923. Again, just proceed to slido.com and use the code 1230923. And we will be giving everyone a few moments to submit their questions before we continue to our Q&A portion. So again, just go to slido.com and use the code 1230923. I've already seen a few questions on the link a while ago. Siguro we should have our water break first before we proceed. Okay, so again, while waiting, regarding the evaluation and the attendance for today's webinar, the evaluation link for today will be sent to your email address you provided during the registration. And please do not share the link with others that is unique to you. It will be available only until 12 midnight, and the evaluation form will also serve as your attendance for today. Release of certificates will be on or before the end of the month. Okay. Okay, I'm seeing questions popping up on the Slido link. And I think we can have the first question now. To continue, may I invite again Dr. Punzalan to be put on the spotlight. Hi, sir.
Hello.
Ayan, okay. Okay. Let's begin with the first question, sir. From the slide, the link. I will begin by mentioning the name if there's any, and then followed by the question. So let's have the first question anonymously. What steps can archivists take to handle sensitive or painful community memories ethically? Again, what steps can archivists take to handle sensitive or painful community memories ethically?
Yeah. So context is really important. In the first place, um, making sure that you are the appropriate institution to handle those records, because most of the time, sometimes those records end up in a repository that is not necessarily the most appropriate repository to handle them. But let's just assume that you are the right institution for for such collection. So your role as an archivist is to basically make sure that those records are preserved and could be used for healing. Healing either through by through justice or for a kind of memory, because sometimes in my own personal experience with community work, what I perceive to be painful memory, like either because it's colonial kind of atrocity that I'm seeing, or like colonial abuse that I'm seeing in sometimes the photographs that I see, or sometimes letters that I read that would have very um, um, how would I say it? Like racialized language around description of people, or a very demeaning way that they describe ancestors of people. I see those and then I would think of them as like, oh, this is really offensive. But sometimes I present those same materials back to descendant communities. Yes, there's a level of like, yeah, we know it's racist and we know that it's colonial and it's problematic and it's difficult. Nevertheless, it's useful to us, you know, for a variety of community reason. So sometimes we miss that. So for me, the ethics is more like, whose discomfort and offense do you prioritize? Because in the US, most of the time I talk to some curators here, especially in my early years of working in the space, that they are like, oh, I'm afraid and I hesitate to just share these records because they contain culturally sensitive material content, and it's offensive, and it makes me uncomfortable. But I said, well, because of your discomfort, those records are inaccessible, and I don't think we should privilege your discomfort over the community. So I think the ethical way actually is creating and forming those reciprocal relationships with communities, contacting them, saying, I have these kinds of records. I think they're really delicate and sensitive, but I don't think it's my place to make that determination. Can we have a conversation and look at this? So informing the community uh, without necessarily being condescending about the approach is very helpful, because I think our the ethics for us is more like balancing access with with respectful consultation. I think what could be deemed unethical is when you start making those collections with culturally sensitive and painful history. Like everyone is gaining access to that collection except the community itself, which happens most of the time. Like everyone knows about it except the community documented by those records. So I think one ethical way to do this is to approach the community and say, what are the sensitive ways I could implement in order to make this accessible and also preserved for the future, because this is still the history of your community. So consultation, I think, is one good way to uh, handle that ethical problem.
Thank you, sir. And I think one role of being an archivist as well is to to keep and make the records accessible, disregarding, of course, our personal belief and personal emotions, I think. So, one of the role of archivists. Sir, while listening to your session a while ago, I come to recall one of the movies I've watched before. If you're familiar with Ang Babae sa Septic Tank by Eugene Domingo. There was a scene there. The filmmakers, of course, in the role of Eugene, proposed adding confrontation scene between Josephine Bracken and Rizal sisters, despite there being no historical records of such an event. And they also guest on the movie Mr. Ambet Ocampo. So Mr. Ambet Ocampo says, hindi pwede yan, walang ganyan because it is not historically recorded. So in that case, this raised an important question about who gets to tell history and whose voices are considered valid. In this context, how can communities meaningfully participate in shaping archival narratives about their own histories while still engaging responsibly with historical evidence and archival records?
Mhm. Well, I think I don't know. I think people should be smart enough to discern the difference between a commercial movie, which is fiction, or historical fiction, or fiction based on history, versus what actually happened, like factual historical event. I mean, maybe I'm being overly generous about people, but that's the general line. If as a society we cannot distinguish between fictionalized interpretation of a historical event versus the real historical event, then our problem is more that of education, and comprehension of history, which I think should be taught in school. You shouldn't learn that in a movie. You should learn, like being able to, uh, distinguish between those. But anyway, so yeah, going back to your question, how can communities, insert their perspective? Well, one is empowering the communities to write their own histories, and also create their own engagements with history. Like one thing that I'm seeing happening right now in many institutions here is what they call co-curation or shared stewardship, meaning inviting community members in the archives and saying, here's a collection about you. um, what would you like us to do other than what we're doing usually, like putting them in folders and boxes, and then here's the finding aid and maybe correct the finding aid and all of that. Sometimes community members will help put up an exhibit, like alongside with the people in the institution, like co-curate an exhibition. um, and there's a range of things that community members could do together with the archivist. In some cases, the archive will return the materials back to the community for their own kind of But these are, communities that have resources and could afford to manage those archives. So the practice of community self sovereignty around their own history and identity is complex, and it's not a one size fits all approach. In the Philippines, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of actual community consultation and for communities having a say on how their histories or culture should be represented um, in our historical materials, not just in books, but also in exhibitions, in the pamphlets we write, in our finding aids, so forth and so on.
Okay. Thank you for that, sir. We have another question here by Justin Hinko. It says here, in Philippine politics nowadays, do you think that preserving the memories on the community level is essential in the pursuit of sustained justice?
Of course, it's essential. I mean, why would I say no? um, you know, um, what is sad is like when archivists and people in power start saying it's not essential. It's not important, dyan ka lang, yung wala ka namang kumbaga you're not part of history, or you are so marginalized and you are at the periphery, therefore you don't your records should not be preserved. I mean, I think that's wrong thinking. If you start thinking that, you should challenge yourself and say, why do I think this way? Meaning you are looking at groups of people as less than you, and therefore less worthy of his history. And I don't think sometimes it's necessarily your job to preserve that community's record, but I think to care about that those records are preserved is part of our values, right? I see a lot of communities around me that I think like they're worthy and they deserve um, a place in history and for their records to be preserved. But sometimes it's not really my job to do the preservation myself. But caring for such effort to happen is part of my values as an archivist, because I want, and in the end, I want those records preserved. Even sometimes it's not necessarily me who should be doing it, nor it's appropriate that I do it myself. So, but that's part of the values that I have. So sometimes the help that I do is just sometimes providing guidance, training, or sometimes encouragement. You will not believe how many communities, even here in the United States that I've been, that they tell me, oh, we're just these people, we're just this small community, we don't matter. So the community itself is basically negating their sense of history and place in history. And it's very important for them to hear somebody, an archival academic like me, saying that's not right. You are worthy of preservation and you should keep in preserving, at least um, connecting your history, what's happening in your community, with the next generation. I think that's has become a problem in the Philippines, like the lack of newer generation understanding what happened in the past. So, somewhat on purpose, I did not use Philippine cases because I want to show you more of resonant cases happening around the world to inspire us that we're not alone in this fight and in this endeavor. Other countries have experienced the same, if not worse, levels of atrocity, and they managed to preserve those records. Why can't Filipinos?
Thank you, sir. And we will now proceed to the last question, sir. And for those who will not be able to answer online, we will be sending the rest of the question on the Slido to Sir Ricky, and then we will be posting or sending the answers through email, sir. So
Mhm.
the final question is from Christine. Regarding records that can be manufactured to obscure events, I'm curious, are disinformation materials considered evidence of obscured events that we should keep?
Mm. Well, that's interesting because most of the time, our remit or our responsibility is on the authentic record that's, and we're there to sometimes say this is authentic and this one is manufactured. But yeah, but that's an interesting point. Maybe just to emphasize the level of um, fake news around us.
The
Just
level of fake news can spread.
yeah,
Maybe.
and then just say, like as an example of, I don't know, it depends. It's also I'm worried about the capacity of archivists to keep records that are not real evidence, and I think that as long as you have a good way of marking them as mm,
Fake news.
inauthentic or
Authentic.
fake or manufactured or fabricated. The word is fabricated
Complicated, yeah.
records. As long as you have a way of distinguishing that and labeling that and making sure, then and you have capacity to do so, sure. But is it our job to, like, I'm sure it's someone is probably collecting those already, right? And
Yeah.
keeping them.
Okay, sir, thank you very much. And again, thank you everyone who participated and shared their questions. And once again, on behalf of the Society of Filipino Archivists, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to you, Dr. Punzalan, for generously sharing your expertise and insight with us today. And thank you for helping us deepen our understanding of archives and their role in advancing reparative memory justice. As a
Mhm.
token of appreciation, we would like to present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Ricardo L. Punzalan. Allow me to read the citation. Society of Filipino Archivists, Certificate of Appreciation. We wish to express our deepest appreciation to Dr. Ricardo L. Punzalan for sharing his knowledge, experience, and expertise in SFA lecture series, Archives for Justice, Rights, Memory, and Futures, held on 9th of June 2026 via Facebook Live, given this 9th day of June 2026. Signed Dr. Francis M. Navarro, Head Education Committee, and our President, Ms. Denise Marie C. Betia.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. I'm planning to visit in August. So I will probably be able to get my certificate in August when I'm in Manila.
That's
Hopefully.
perfect. Yes, that's perfect, sir. Because before we conclude our program, allow me to share our upcoming face-to-face seminar this coming August, where we will be having CNOP 2026, Hands-on Heritage, a workshop on paper conservation, this coming August 5 to 7, to be hosted by Ateneo de Manila
Mm.
University. So we encourage all archivists, records professionals, librarians, students, researchers, and heritage advocates to join us in this learning opportunity. So just stay tuned to our official Facebook page for more complete program details, registration information, and announcements. Ayan. So perfect pala, Dr. Ricky. We'll be seeing you in August, hopefully during this time. So again, we look forward to seeing everyone, and of course, Dr. Ricky in person during our upcoming seminar this August 5 to 6. And to bring us all to the end of our lecture series, again, on behalf of the Society of Filipino Archivists, thank you for joining us and celebrating the International Archives Week 2026. May today's discussion inspire us to continue preserving records, safeguarding memory, and advancing justice through archives. Stay safe and stay informed and have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you very much, and God bless us all.